Hello, my name is this, and we're talking a blah 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 blah. Okay. Well, it's been a little while. What do you say we do another Game Design Corner? For those of you who missed the first one, Game Design Corner is where we focus specifically on aspects of game design. As always, I'm joined by professional game designer James Portnow, the actual brains of this outfit. If you remember last time, we talked about the differences between problems and choices, and their distinctive functions in game design. If you haven't seen that episode yet, don't worry, today's topic won't go over your head. Go watch it later, though. It was a good one. I'm not really sure why you're watching this one first if you haven't even... what was I talking about? Right, yes. So today we're going to do a bit more talking about choices, specifically moral choices. Despite their growing popularity, moral choice systems are a feature game designers just haven't exactly mastered yet. Many games have tried, and some have done pretty damn well, but in the end it just feels like they're all having us choose whether we want to be Hitler or Mother Teresa. We see it all the time, even in the best of games. Infamous, Fable, Knights of the Old Republic, Bioshock, Mass Effect, Fallout, the list goes on. But this isn't really news to anyone. We've all poked fun at this shortcoming in games with morality systems. But why is it a problem? Well, when a game faces you with a question like, do I kill this little girl and eat her soul to grow my own unholy power? Or do I restore her lost innocence and return to her the childhood that was stolen from her by despicable men? It's not something you're going to spend all day pondering. Which is a problem. Why? Because there's nothing really fun or engaging about it. The thing that makes real moral questions interesting is how fuzzy they are, how endlessly debatable they can be. So why is this such a hard thing to pull off? A lot of people may lay the blame on bad writing, but I don't think the writers are to blame for this one. I think it comes down to something much simpler. Money. When most people think of deep moral choices, they think about a breadth of options. But a broad set of options for a storyline decision usually means a very divergent story, and a divergent story means more content, and more content is going to cost more development dollars, and those dollars are almost never there. Let's look at one of the more successful attempts at providing meaningful moral choices in a game. Why does Fallout succeed? Well, consider the kind of game that Fallout is. It's all about exploring a huge open world. There's a central chain of quests to take you through the main plot, but the rest of the Fallout map is packed with other things to do, settlements to discover, side quests to undertake, enemies to bring down. From the very beginning, Fallout's developers had the luxury of assuming that most players would never see all of the game's content, which meant they were okay with developing content that a player might never encounter. These guys could go right up to their boss and say, I want to make a new area that 75% of players will never ever see, and the boss was totally cool with it. Now compare that scenario with a more linear game like Bioshock. Consider how much more impact they could have given the major moral decision in that game if they'd been able to build 4 more levels. 2 exclusively for people who saved the Little Sisters, and 2 exclusively for people who didn't. But that would have cost a lot, and for a game like Bioshock, that sort of thing would never fly when the money could be spent sprucing up levels that everyone would see. But just because this is a development issue doesn't mean that we're screwed. Remember, ambiguous moral choice is different from totally free moral choice, and ambiguous moral choice is really all we need to present in order to give players that satisfying introspective moment. Let's go back to Fallout for a second. Where did Fallout fail, even though it had great writing and a huge open world with nearly endless content? They tied choice to a progress bar. The karma meter, or righteous meter, or whatever it is, kills any possibility for a moral choice to be ambiguous. It forces every moral choice and all of their answers to share a single plane and then quantizes them. No complexity, no ambiguity. Every decision you make is this good or this evil. It's unfortunate that almost every game that tries to offer moral choices uses this mechanic. If we're going to buck this trend, we have to shift our thinking a bit, and the first thing we have to do is to stop thinking of moral choice as a game system and start considering individual moral choices on their own terms. This makes it much easier to craft ambiguous moral choices because it lets you build scenarios that have no clear good answer. Ambiguity comes from having to decide what's the most good in a situation that is mostly bad. Once again, going back to Fallout. In the Pit expansion, you're given the choice of kidnapping a child in order to help a group of slaves find a cure for a disease they're afflicted with, or killing the leader of the slave revolt to protect the child from being taken from her parents. Neither of these options are wholly righteous choices, and the player's forced to weigh the good of many against the fate of an individual child. That's the kind of choice that really forces people to think, and it's the kind of moral choice that developers should strive to deliver. But, as we said, choices like these can start to make things expensive, so how can a developer create these types of choices without driving up costs? I suppose one way would be to just pack your game full of these choices without giving them any real impact on the game world. And while this approach is fairly easy to pull off, let's assume for now that it's not enough. What can we do instead to allow ambiguous moral choices to have real impact on the game without forcing us to create a great deal of new content? The first and obvious answer is to repurpose, or reconfigure old content to present it in new ways that better suit the player's possible answers. You know, like reusing a location but changing the NPC or enemy spawns, or altering dialogue that isn't voice acted, etc. There are a million different ways to do this, but in the interest of time, I won't go too deep into it now. Suffice it to say that it's cheap and it works. Another good way is to limit your game to a single question of morality. You can make an entire game out of a good moral dilemma. What makes a war just? How do you balance the good of the many against the rights of a few? Really, a game centered around questions like this doesn't even have to be any more complex or divergent than the standard do you want to be good or evil model we have now. Except these moral dilemmas contain much more depth in the decision making, and lend a lot more consequence and weight to the player's actions. Shadow of the Colossus is a great example of a game based on a single moral dilemma, and hell, that game didn't even have any diverging paths. Or here's another option. We can just keep using the exact same system we use for moral choices right now, but hide the statistical effects. Don't put +2 to Paragon on the screen every time the player does something nice. Game designers, I know resisting this urge for direct quantification goes against everything that's been ingrained into you over the years. I mean, almost all of your training has been in presenting logical puzzles. But ambiguous moral choices, by their very nature, can't be simply reduced to a logic puzzle. In real life, these challenges don't have an obvious right answer, nor do they have a definitive metric to tell you how you did. If you want to present real moral dilemmas in your game, you'll have to present them as they actually are in life. But, okay, let's say you are still dead set on using a visible metric for a player's moral choices. Well, here are a few ideas for improvement. Rather than keeping that standard single-axis meter as the player's progress bar of morality, might we suggest looking to the humble color wheel for inspiration? As often as people talk about moral dilemmas in terms of shades and colors, it seems a little odd that we keep using such a linear, numeric metaphor to represent a character's moral state. Even something as simple as a wheel or a graph, where the character's choices are weighed on independent axes, would give much greater diversity to the moral dimensions of a character. For example, let's say we dropped the good and evil meter and replaced it with this color wheel here. Then we could plot some opposing values across each axis. Let's say discipline versus freedom on this axis, and the good of the many versus the rights of the few on the other. Now, if we use this metric to gauge a player's moral characteristics, we can design choices which force the player to balance the things he values. Now choices aren't just black and white, good and evil, Jedi or Sith puzzles. Here, a choice might raise a player's freedom value, but decrease their rights of the few, or perhaps lower their discipline, but increase the good of the many. A player might be willing to trample on individual rights a little in order to follow the dictates of discipline, but just when they cross the line and risk rebellion is, in and of itself, an important, meaningful, and ambiguous choice. Or here's another mechanic that lends itself well to morality systems: factions. I'm kind of surprised they've been used so little for this purpose. Ever since the 1999 launch of EverQuest, faction has been a firmly established game mechanic. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept, faction is simply the idea of giving the player a numerical rating for how much they're liked by each of the different NPC groups in the game. For example, you could have a faction rating of +20 with the Wood Elves, who like you quite a bit. Or perhaps you have a faction rating of -10 with the Paladins, who aren't really that thrilled with you right now. Your character's standing with a particular faction determines how NPC members of that faction will treat you. This mechanic inherently does something fantastic. It externalizes the morality of the game. Instead of being told that any given action is good or evil, the player is instead informed of how that action is perceived by different groups in the game. You can explore all kinds of different moral schema in this system. Any particular action might be seen as good by one group or evil by another, further removing us from the realm of absolute morality and allowing for truly debatable moral questions to be raised. And speaking of absolute moral choices, that brings me to another thing. The only thing that makes absolute moral choices interesting is how difficult it often is to do the right thing. Example, I'd love to give each homeless person I see $1, but at some point this becomes difficult. When I look at my wallet and see that all I've got left is $4, exactly enough to pay for the burger I went out for in the first place, that's when the moral choice actually becomes interesting. Now I have to overcome my own desires in order to do the right thing. Doing good in games almost never brings us to that sort of moral precipice. In most games, doing good is usually just as easy as doing ill. And when the game does ask the player to sacrifice, that sacrifice is usually a joke, like giving up a clip of ammo out of our stockpile of 10,000. If we want to deal with ambiguous moral choices, we owe the player the enjoyment of having to choose when they get to do good, rather than allowing them to mindlessly choose the option that gives them +1 to sanctimony. By making it prohibitively expensive or difficult to do good all the time, you make the choice to do unmitigated good interesting again. The fact is that life very rarely has us choosing between good and evil. More often we simply muddle through, choosing the options that we believe to be the best. And even then, when we at last come to believe we've ascertained what's right, we're beset with different conceptions of good. And then, in those rarest of cases where we can actually choose unmitigated good, it often comes at great cost to ourselves. Morality is a complicated issue, and it should be treated as such. Not only because doing so will create more compelling game experiences, but because it'll let us really stretch this medium and, dare I say it, do some good. What?